This program contains content that may be unsuitable for children. Parental guidance is suggested.
Life Christian Television presents a special presentation on mental health through a biblical view, Pathway to Healing and Wholeness, with your host, Lisa Eady.
Hello and welcome to Pathway to Healing and Wholeness. I'm your host, Lisa Eady, Christian counselor and author of the book, The 7 Principles of Healing Trauma. And today we are excited to have Dr. Gregory Reid in the house as we talk about his new book, The Diary of a Devil Hunter, and dive into all things deliverance and healing and wholeness and freedom. And so I kind of want you to just introduce yourself. Tell us about your background and how that book came to be.
Well, my background is I was raised in Southern California, had 2 very good parents. My dad was a police officer. I'm a part-time nurse, and then just raised my brothers and I. But I was taken into the network of a local, very dark, Hollywood-connected pedophile and occult group that called children like myself and brought us into their circle so that they could use us for anything from pornography to actual, literal, demonic, satanic rituals, which they, because of my background, they had already been kind of looking at my family. And so they picked me out of the herd, so to speak. And I'm using those terms deliberately because they do not consider children humans. They call them their animals. And so they called me out of the herd from the rest and began to initiate me with all the trauma, the sexual abuse, everything. When I was about 14, I was in a complete meltdown. I had watched my closest friend lose his life when he was 13 and I was 11 in one of those ritual settings. So I just scrambled. I didn't become what they call dissociative or MPD, but I was just a total mess. Began to drink. I began to operate in the occult very heavily. And then when I was 14 and a half, Jesus he didn't step down. He brought me to himself. He literally, and I don't say this often because I know everybody's got stories, but he literally took me from where I cried out in my bedroom when I was 14 and a half and said, if there's anybody out there, Buddha, Muhammad, whoever, if there's anybody, please, because I can't live. I didn't want to live. And in that moment, I was taken, it was a longer thing that happened, but I was taken to heaven and held in the arms of Jesus Christ and feeling loved for the first time in my life. And then I'm back in my room and I'm like, you're real.
Yeah.
Now what?
Now, yeah, what's next? I'm thinking when you're talking about that, about Chris Valentin from Bethel, but he gives his experience of, he cried out like that. Just God, if you're real, kind of just it was almost a challenge because he just did not believe, had not felt love. And he said, God stepped in, did the thing he asked. He said, if you heal my mom, I'll know you're real. And he woke up and his mom's healed.
Wow.
And then he says, for 4 years, he goes in search of the what's next, trying to find this Jesus that he encountered. Yeah. And the sad thing is, and what I want to talk about today is how equipped are leaders to deal with people who suffered like you did and many more that are still suffering, and how can we better equip the church. But Chris Valentin, in his book, School of the Prophets, he writes about his experience, and he tells that for 4 years he went church to church to church, and he said, I did not find that Jesus I encountered.
And that is part of what my experience, the people that led me to the Lord, it was just a house church. It was back in the time of the whole Jesus revolution. And the guy was just a landscaper that came to the Lord, opened up his house. And I was just one of those kids that God brought in. But I got passed from one adult to another. Everybody with good intentions. They'd say, I need help. Well, and they would listen to me and say, I can't help you, but I know who could. And they passed me to several people, including a long fatal deliverance situation. And it was not until years later that God, because this was all going to take time. I came to saved, but totally a mess. And no one knew what to do with that kind of a mess. And when I finally have healed up over the years, and it took many years, first I had to get unaddicted to the occult. Then I had to get unaddicted to having a major problem that brought attention to myself. And I had to start really looking at what was really there, because I wasn't totally sure until we really dug. And then I realized how deep it went. And as the healing came along through a whole process, that very little of it came through human hands, because I feel like God sought for somebody, and nobody was able to come into that picture.
Even though you were actively in the church.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I finally came to a place where I told the Lord, I said, I want nothing but the truth. I want you to help me, heal me, get me through this, because it got to a point where the memories were so severe that if I saw one little fragment of something, I would have what we called a flashback back then, and all of a sudden I would have to go be by myself, because a whole scenario would open up like a TV screen, and I would relive everything. I wouldn't feel it as I was seeing it. It was only afterwards that raw pain came out. But it was afterwards when I finally put it into a story called Nobody's Angel, which I never intended originally to be a book, but it became a book. And I sent it to the gentleman that led me to the Lord, he and his wife, and he called me. And it was such a wonderful moment, because he said, Jen, his wife, Jen and I knew that we were hurt. You were hurting so bad. We had no idea how to help you. We didn't know what was wrong. But now that we read your book, now we understand.
Yeah. And I think that's a big part, is the church has to take time to understand. Because I know for myself in our ministry, I know there have been individuals that come to us, especially in the beginning of our ministry, that I know we did not have the tools to help. And that sent us on a journey deeper. And I started in just Christian counseling and inner healing, to heal myself. Because I was still broken when we entered the ministry, and I was still being triggered by those I was trying to help. So I had to go deeper. And it took years. And I can remember being on our back deck with John Eckhart's book. I think it's Breaking Curses and Routing Demons or something. And as I'm reading it and thinking generationally, I'm like, this whole book applies to me. So I'm just on my back deck, prayer by prayer, just digging this thing out from the root, trying to get to a point of wholeness. And when I think about trauma, it's not what happened to you, but it's what happens inside of you because of what happened to you. So you can have two people go through the same event and have a very different reaction.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so I've seen over the years those with complex trauma, those with deep, deep wounds of their psyche, because trauma is a wound of the psyche that it literally leaves an imprint on our nervous system. So we see these individuals, yes, they need immediate care, they need immediate rescue that we've seen with traffic victims, but then there are years of reparenting, of discipleship, of dealing with behaviors, renewing the mind. There is the deliverance, but then there's the inner healing, the healing of the mind, will, and emotions, and that takes time and patience. And really, in my opinion, the discipleship model that Jesus modeled of bringing them in as family.
Yes.
How long do you think from that 14 that the major part, because I know lifelong we still deal in layers sometimes. I mean, life happens, and so we have to go back and heal a little more. But for the major part of your healing to bring you into wholeness, what that looked like?
I began all this when I, of course, came to the Lord at 14 and a half, and I think I was close to being 31 or 32 when I had worked through most of the trauma, most of the flooding, as they call it, came through between the ages of about 21 to about 28. And it just, every day was something I had to work through. I did a lot of journaling, but it was hard, because I was in ministry at the time. And I would go home and what am I doing? Because I'm living, it's like I'm living two lives. Yeah. I'm living for Jesus. I'm preaching the gospel. I believe all of that. I'm not doing anything to distract from that or to bring shame or whatever. I kept the pain on this level. So I had this other life in which I would go home sometimes and smash a hole in the wall,
Yeah.
or just rage, or just sit in a corner and cry for hours because I felt so abandoned. And these were rough spots. So it helped me to know that that was okay, that it was going to take time, because, not all surgeries are the same. I mean, I've
Exactly.
had enough experience with that to know that sometimes you go in to a hospital, a person will go in for one, and they'll do part of the healing, then the person has to, the surgery, and then have to heal up and go back in. And I know for survivors, that's painful. It's like,
It is.
I would love for it to be one and done.
That would be nice.
And I've actually been praying for, in the light of understanding how much it takes, I'm praying that God would grant us accelerated healing for these type of things. And I think God's capable of doing that, but we really need to help survivors to know that it's okay to just, hold out
Yeah.
and just, hang on for the duration.
And that you're not broken.
Right.
Because you can feel broken, but the Lord, when He comes in to heal us, He can heal that brokenness, and that there is hope, that initial thing that you felt was the love of God.
Yes.
And I think understanding God's love for us is essential in our healing, because most of us that had dealt with trauma, especially complex trauma, you do feel abandoned. And then when we see the emotions that come out, the anger as you're talking about, or the sorrow, what is that teaching us? Like, because for me, this is what I tell my clients, when that emotion comes, that is a symptom of an unmet need. So because anger is always secondary to frustration or fear,
Yes.
Something that is unmet, and to begin to learn. And I think for leaders in the body of Christ, understanding the difference between the wounded and the wicked.
Very important.
It is, because we can rewound. I think about Saul was wicked. We see his heart was wicked. He was eventually rejected by God. But then you see somebody like Peter, who is wanting to call fire down from heaven, who is, he got mad and denied the Lord. Then it says he cussed, he ran off. He's all these things. He's in fear. He goes back to what he knew before. But he wasn't wicked. He was wounded.
Yes.
He had just been traumatized by the cross. And so he goes back to what he knew. And for leaders to really understand the difference where they don't rewound, I think is huge in learning this process. Share something with us about when you started putting the book together.
Which one? The Devil Hunter?
The Diary of a Devil Hunter.
Well, when I first came to the city I'm in now, I was still looking for answers, because I thought I was the only person that had ever been through this experience. And I met a lady here who had God had given her a ministry actually dealing with people who had been through that. Wow. And I realized that God was going to have me move down here, and I thought I would just get healed and then help her with her presentations we did for churches. And we were so naive about the occult back then. We're doing little things on the Smurfs and stuff. And we didn't realize that right in back of us was a tidal wave of evil that was about to hit this country like nothing I have ever seen in my lifetime. And all of a sudden, kids are committing suicide. Kids are being ritually sacrificed. Church burnings, every evil you can possibly imagine being done in the name of Satan. And nobody was prepared. So all of a sudden we're getting calls from law enforcement. We're like, well, we're just doing Smurfs.
Yeah.
So we kind of had to learn as we went along. And it didn't take long, because particularly in our city, we were inundated with actual working cases of people doing criminal activity. I got invited into the sphere of adult probation and juvenile probation all over the state, and then in Oklahoma. And pretty soon our file cabinets were full of cases. And at some point, we went from working on those things to it just dovetailed into what we now call human trafficking. Back then we didn't call it that. We called it child trading, child porn. But the minute we bumped up against it, and we felt that pushback, and it's like, and then our lives started to get threatened. I thought, whoa.
That's when you realize it's a spiritual battle. This is not a physical thing.
And also that the things that are behind it are not little things. My mentor was Captain Chris Bratton from Round Rock Police Department, and he allowed me to participate in some of his classes, and then he helped me with the case I was working on. And at this time, he said, you need to think long and hard about what you're doing. And he said back then, even then, he said it was a $15 billion a year industry in children. Now I think it's way over 100 billion.
I believe it.
And it's one of the things that drives me still, because we still have 250,000 children unaccounted for. Somebody knows exactly where they are.
Over the last 4 years.
Yes. And there's this, we hit that level of organized cover up because of the people that were doing these things. We're in very powerful positions. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I shy away from that stuff.
Yeah.
And even sometimes when I hear people with elaborate stories about all the people and politicians that they've been, and I'm like, I'm very skeptical, because there are things that are and aren't. Anyway, I began to, from the very beginning, and for some reason, God's given me like a file cabinet, like it's just full of being able to retain facts. And I've kept every scrap of everything. And I thought at some point, we did the work we did from 87 to about 95. And then we got completely shut down by a national movement that came up through law enforcement, psychological community, Christian community, to say, it's all bogus, none of it ever happened.
Yeah.
And we went from 250 crack investigators, I'm talking about people who, would go to the gates of hell for these kids, to we're down to 5 now. And I thought at some point, somebody has to tell the truth, because the truth is definitely not out there. They've silenced the truth. So Diary of a Devil Hunter is simply, especially having left or lost almost every one of our friends, either through death or whatever, that I'm one of the only survivors that went through it and say, hey, don't tell me it didn't happen. It did happen, and because it did happen, and here's the receipts, so to speak, you need to know that it is still happening.
Absolutely. That it's still, and I feel like the cries are silent, and that the bride is ignorant. I believe ignorance. I don't think it's a willful, the church doesn't want to help. But when we speak on human trafficking, when we speak on domestic violence, and we go to the pastors, we have been told, oh, not in my church, not in my church. And when we moved to the borderland, and have been all over the world, I had never seen an evil like I see. And this is the #1 border in the world for human trafficking. And I would begin to tell our supporters, and they're like, oh, you're tired. And we just kept working, and I was getting sick. And I would tell stories, and you could tell that they didn't believe me.
Right.
Like, that's way out there stuff. I held a hand of a woman in Juarez, and we were encouraging her to leave. And we were doing her nails and praying. And she looked at me, and she would not leave because she had left twice, and the police had took her back because they were part of the cartel. And I said, well, then what can I do to help? And she grabbed my hands, and she looked me in the eyes, and she said, you tell the world that the women of Juarez are not free. And I will never forget that moment. And we saw so many. And I feel like in Ephesians 5:11, it says, have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. And so the few of us that are screaming from the rooftops, I feel like the screams of these children that are being ritually abused, that are being trafficked, are almost silent screams, because the bride has shut her ears. And maybe not willfully, but in my opinion, there's so much occult activity, and there's so much satanic activity in the churches that they have a door open. When I think about, I saw in Atlanta, it was they were basically having a reading. It was not prophetic. This was a psychic reading at their church, at their women's conference. They were doing yoga. Yeah. They were, all these things that we know are that Satan works on legal grounds. He works on authority. And I believe that much of the body of Christ has opened herself up to attack because she has given over her authority.
And and when the other book that I wrote, it's called War of the Ages. It's about spiritual warfare, because I realize I have a mentality about it that is, you deal with warfare the way you deal, some ways, with human warfare. One of the things I saw very clearly is You cannot fight Satan if you've got his toys in your back pocket. He's going to expose you for being a fraud from the get-go. And some people don't know, and it's a very delicate thing with the church, because I realize a lot of people don't know. And if they don't know, they don't know.
Exactly.
When they do know, then they're responsible. But there's a lot of people who are in the happy bubble that's like, I'd rather not know. And a lot of pastors are saying, I just think you're trying to glorify the devil and I don't want to hear. And we're out there, when you, forgive me, when you hold a child in your arms who's about to be returned to their abusers, and you're the only thing standing between that child and that abuser, and you lose that case, then you feel like I have to cry out, because this is one of so many others. And I understand it's hard for people, and I think part of it, it's kind of a little bit of different side. I remember that Lincoln, when he was conducting the war, I think he wrote a letter to, I think it was the Secretary of the Navy, Seward, who was just a completely worthless person. And he wrote to me, he said, Secretary Stewart, if you're not using your army, can I please borrow it for a while? And I kind of feel like that with the church. It's like I'm not asking people to do the only things that you can do and I can do. I feel very limited in this war. I'm more of a town crier and be able to tell people what's coming and where it is. But I don't expect people to be able to do this, but support those who can.
Yes.
We're willing to do the work, but we can't be out there just getting shot at without knowing that we don't have any backup.
Yeah.
And so,
even prayer, like appropriate prayer. We got a message one time. We were going on a trip, and an apostolic father of ours, he messaged our pastor, and he said, those kids don't have enough prayer cover. And he said, I felt it. The Lord woke me up. He said, somebody's not praying, and their lives are on the line. And so what do you think, if we could have, and of course there's many, and this is going to be a two-part episode, how can the church support this work with saving the children, but also just when we think about deliverance and inner healing, what is the number one thing that leaders can do? Like something that is tangible that they can say, we can work with this. This is how we can help.
well, I think first of all, leaders need to get educated on what true deliverance is, true spiritual warfare, because there's been far too much nonsense out there, gang deliverance, where everybody just piles on and wants to take a spin at the wheel, or demon lists where you check off every problem you've had and then cast out the appropriate. That doesn't work. Not scriptural. Learning the proper way to do battle, I think, for leaders to have that, because it's coming to the church.
Yeah.
But right there, it's out there in the world, and they're going to have to learn how to confront that. I think training up youth groups, not necessarily in the hardcore stuff, but we've minimized their ability to become warriors with the Word of God, because they're the ones that are fighting the battle in the schools.
Yes.
It's not the parents. We're trying, but it's the kids that have to face it. And I think if we can just take this seriously, and as you know, there's always an edge. I have to be careful that I don't push people past a level of their pain threshold in telling them this. But I give them enough to say, we need you to raise up the church to be strong and to be ready to embrace the unembraceable, those that are wounded and bleeding and may sit on the back row, and this may be their last hope.
Yeah, and may come in. They're going to look different. They're going to act different, and sometimes the wounded and the wicked can look similar.
Absolutely.
Sometimes they are still manifesting in areas of their mind that haven't been renewed, and for years, maybe decades, they have learned defense mechanisms.
Yes.
They're not just going to believe you. They're not just going to trust you right off if they've been through deep level abuse and hurt. And so they're going to have some behaviors that we have to stick it out. They're going to be regressed. I try to tell leaders, if they started using substance at 5 years old, at 10 years old, at 15 years old, or if the abuse started at 5, 10, 15, they're going to have some social regression. So you may be dealing with a 30-year-old woman or man, but they may have the social age of a 5-year-old. We had a young woman who had been through the occult. She had been severely sexually abused, physically abused, rejected in every kind of way. We had to move her in our house to really help her. And she was the same age as me, but I treated her like I treated our daughters. And she would go out, we had a swing on a tree, and she would go out there and swing for hours. Because she didn't have a childhood where you could go get on a swing and just swing at peace and nobody bother you. And we live in the middle of the woods. And she would just go out there and swing and really found healing in that. And it was a long process with her. And every story is not a successful one. Sometimes they go back.
Yeah.
I mean, you do what you can do, but I think discipleship has to be where you're willing to say, I'm going to give you my time. I'm going to give you my life. We're going to eat dinner together. You will not help these people on a Sunday morning only routine. That's
Absolutely.
not enough.
You're right.
And in the next episode, I really want to get into what real deliverance looks like and how it's not being done correct, because I know for us, we've seen everybody that needs deliverance, which is getting rid of the demons, then needs inner healing to heal the emotional wounds that were caused, that the trauma actually caused. But everybody that needs inner healing doesn't necessarily have a demon. Just because you've been traumatized does not mean you are demonically possessed. Now, it can be likely because demons hide in these wounds to keep people from freedom, but it's not always. And I think the church really educating herself on those two differences and on trauma-informed practices. How do we deal with people? I think everybody from the nursery to senior leadership, if you're dealing with people, need to be trauma-informed, because
Absolutely.
in our world today, a lot of people have been traumatized.
Yes.
I mean, our society is set up as toxic, just the way with the parents out of the home, you know, people feel rejected. So we're getting ready to close this episode, but we want you guys to stay tuned. We are going to be back with Dr. Gregory Reid, and we are going to go even further. But if you are suffering today from any of these things that we have mentioned, if you have been through trauma, if you have been through abuse, I want to give you hope that what Dr. Gregory Reid said about Jesus just holding him, that the Lord is for you, that he loves you, and it says he has come to heal the brokenhearted and to bind up their wounds, and there is hope that only he can bring. So until next time, this is Lisa Eady, your host for Pathway to Healing and Wholeness.
The advice on this program is not intended to replace that of psychiatric care. If you or someone you know needs help, call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, dial 988 or 1-800-2738-255. You can also go to suicidepreventionlifeline.org.